Hey everybody, just as a reminder, I'm a narrator on Chilling, the awesome horror app that features over 1,000 horror stories, over a dozen narrators, some of who you might know from YouTube, as well as full-length novels and exclusive series, and Chilling originals. You can select and change the ambient sound on the background of these stories whenever you want without affecting the story that you're listening to. And we release hours of new stories every week. Click the link in the description to download and start your free trial to see if you like it. When the people next door moved out, I was over the moon. It meant no more having to listen to the dog they kept tied up in the backyard yapping morning, noon, and night. It was a horrible animal, looked closer to a rodent than a hound. It meant no more being woken up at 2 a.m. by the sound of tires screeching to a halt. I would lie in the dark staring up towards the ceiling, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for what came next. The slurred and raised voices, the doors being slammed shut, and then the music beginning. It went on some nights until dawn, and I didn't get any sleep. The people next door moving out also meant no more things would be thrown into my backyard by them. No more crushed beer cans or empty popcorn boxes. I swear they thought my backyard was a refuse dump. I complained, of course. I phoned and wrote to the authorities. I was told at first to keep a diary of the disturbances, which I did. And when I sent copies of that, I was told that somebody would come visit. But they never did. I called the cops as well, but they didn't come either. Through all of this, I never confronted the people next door directly, though I wanted to so badly. I was convinced if I had, that they would become violent, and I was not somebody who could defend themselves in a fight. And so I suffered, for 5 years in all, until that day when I was taking out my trash, like a civilized person does, with it in a bag tied at the top that I would put in my bin. I was stood on my front porch when I saw the trunk of their car open and there were suitcases and bags on the ground. And then the man appeared. He was staggering under the weight of a large cardboard box, which he loaded into the trunk before slamming the lid closed. Or he tried anyway. But the box was too big to fit in and the lid wouldn't shut. A reasonable person would have taken the box out and tried a different arrangement. But not him. He slammed the lid down again and again, cussing each time that he failed. And then he just seemed to give up and he left the trunk hanging open while he turned his attention to throwing the suitcases and bags into the back seat of the car. There was no sign of his partner, and the part of me which enjoyed late-night true crime shows on TV as a guilty pleasure began to wonder if he had done away with her. If one of their drunken arguments had gone too far and she was now buried out in the backyard. But no, she appeared. A handbag dangling off each arm and carrying the yapping monster. It had on a little red neckerchief. Ignoring the man who was now trying to force more bags into the back seat, even though they were clearly full, she got in the passenger seat and sat there while the dog squirmed and yapped. Finally, he managed to force the back doors of the car closed and climb behind the wheel. The engine started on the third attempt and they rattled away. My house and theirs were the only two around and were situated at the end of a mile-long narrow road. Everything else for a good distance was woodland. After they had pulled away and disappeared out of sight, I went to stand in the middle of the road and I listened. And do you know what I heard? Nothing, except the chatter of the birds in the trees and a few branches being rustled by the breeze. A couple of tears ran down my face. I wiped them away and went back inside my house. It was such a good feeling. A weight had been lifted. I hoped. Had they really been them moving out, or were they just going on vacation and in a week or two they would be back, and my waking nightmare would start over? I was mightily relieved then when a couple of days later, a truck pulled up in front of the house and a for sale sign was erected next to the porch. I said, "Yes," and I punched the air. That got me a funny look from the man who had put the sign up, but he said nothing and packed his tools up and drove away. I went over to have a closer look at the sign. I couldn't imagine what the point of it was. This was a dead-end road, so there were no passing traffic. No one walked along here either. Maybe it was something the realtors did automatically for all the properties that they handled, I figured, and then I punched the air again. The for sale sign didn't matter. What did matter was that I was finally free of my horrible neighbors and their dog, the yapping rodent beast. I went back into my house. I never drank alcohol, but if there had been a beer in the fridge, I would have cracked it open. As it was, I made myself a cup of peppermint tea and took a chair out into the backyard, where I drank my tea and listened to the sounds of the woods uninterrupted by anything or anyone. It was early evening by the time that I went back inside. I liked everything to be just so in my house. The pans in the kitchen were hung in order of size. The knives, forks, and spoons were all in their separate drawers, and I rinsed out the bin in the kitchen at least once a day with hot water. It was the same in all of the other rooms in the house, and there was one cozy, clean room in particular that I wanted to be in that moment in time. I went upstairs to my bedroom. I was shattered and fell asleep the moment that my head hit the pillows. I slept straight through and woke feeling refreshed. The sunlight streaming in through the window had never looked so good. I had inherited the house from my parents when they had passed, and I thought about them as I started giving it a spring clean. I spent all day happily dusting and vacuuming and polishing, and that night, I slept well again. The only thing that started to intrude on my positive mood over the days that followed was worrying about who might buy the house next door and move in. What if they were even worse than their predecessors? It was possible, but I told myself that it was going to be okay. As soon as somebody new moved in, I would go over and introduce myself with a smile and a handshake. It would be a good start, a neighborly start. It turned out, though, that I was worrying about the wrong thing. About 2 months after the people next door moved out, a truck pulled up outside and the man that I recognized from last time took the for sale sign down. What did that mean, I wondered? If the house had been bought, surely a sold notice would have been pasted over the sign in place. Realtors are never shy to sing their own praises, even if I was the only person who could see that they had closed another deal. Also, no one had been to view the property as far as I knew. After a period of feeling pretty settled, my nerves started to jangle. I had to know what was going on. I found the number of the realtors online and I called them up. Hi, I said. I'm interested in the property on Creech Lane. I would like to arrange a viewing. This was a lie, of course, a way to get them to open up to me. And it worked. The man who had answered paused for a second before replying. Yes, that property was on our books, he said, and then there was another pause. My heart started to beat a little bit quicker. Come on, don't leave me hanging, I thought. The owner of the property put it up for sale after his tenants moved out without giving notice, he finally continued. But sadly, he passed away and the house now cannot be sold until probate is complete. I believe there may be complications around this. Family disputes, though, I really can't say anymore. However, it does mean that the lawyer acting for the estate has asked us to take the property off the market, which is a shame, but we have a number of similar properties available. If I can just begin by taking your name. I ended the call before I could get dragged into a sales pitch, and then went to get a glass of water from the kitchen. My hands were shaking as I drank it. What I had learned had come as a shock. My nightmare neighbors had not owned the house next door, it seemed, and the person who had was dead, leaving the illegal vultures to move in, which left me wondering, how long would the house next door remain unsold and empty? The thought of living next door to a property that was as good as abandoned had bothered me. I put a jacket on and stepped out into my front porch, locked my door. I always did, you can never be too careful. And I walked towards the house next door. I had never been inside and had kept my distance while the house was occupied. As much of a distance as I could while living side by side with those horrible people. The front yard was overgrown with weeds and I noticed a crushed beer can sat by their porch. I decided to leave it where it was. I would come back later with gloves on and a garbage bag to put it in. There were cigarette butts lying among the weeds as well, as if somebody was trying to seed the ground with them and grow a bumper new crop of cancer sticks. The pane on the front door was peeling off and there was a hairline crack in the window nearest to the door. None of this came as a surprise to me. I had made a point of not even wanting to look at the house. It unsettled me, it was so dirty and disheveled. But seeing it up close like this and making myself see the truth warts and all left me feeling depressed. I moved slowly around the side and peered into one of the windows there. The glass was filthy, but I could see pizza boxes standing open on the floorboards, and burger cartons on a small table in front of a TV and more scattered across the floor. Shriveled fries lay spilled out of one. There was what must have been a burger bun as well, only now it was covered in green spores. And as I stared, I began to make out tiny specks circling the floor. They were flies, I realized, a lot of them too. I had the awful feeling that there must be a lot more refuse in the house, food and who knew what else, and that the people next door had not bothered to throw out before they left. They just left it to rot and it had attracted the flies, and worse. As I watched, a maggot wriggled out of one of the burger cartons. I walked away, went back into my house and sat there feeling sick. I just wanted to live in a nice place and have a quiet life, but the house next door was ruining everything. After a while, I dragged myself upstairs. I was too unhappy to do anything, so I went to bed. I couldn't get to sleep though, and around 4 a.m., according to the clock by my bedside, I heard a noise outside. There was someone moving around. Now, like I've said, the road doesn't lead anywhere and no one had any reason to be near my house or the one next door, unless they were lost or up to no good. I got out of bed and crept over to the window to try and see who was out there, and I saw a dark shape trot past. It wasn't a person, it was an animal, some kind of dog, I guessed as my eyes had adjusted to the dark. It was big and feral looking. I had never seen the like before around here and was wondering what had attracted it. When I saw it pad over to the house next door and began sniffing around the door. Was it the scent of the mess that people had left behind that had drawn it in? It continued its sniffing as it moved around the house until it was out of sight. I went back to my bed and sat down. Not only was the house next door an eyesore, and a bug-infested one at that, it was now attracting scavengers. I could have wept. Through the rest of that night and the days and sleepless nights that followed, I did a lot of thinking. I felt like a victim and I hated that, but what could I do? One idea that I had was to sell my house and buy another place with the proceeds. It would break my heart to walk away from the house that had meant so much to my parents, in which they had gifted to me, but if I stayed here, I was worried that I would become ill with all the stress and worry. Trouble was, I knew having an empty house next door that was already in such a bad state would massively devalue my property. Financially, it would be a disaster. I kept trying to think of other options, but I just couldn't. The weeks and months continued to drift by. I started keeping my windows closed all the time because there was an increasingly bad smell coming from the house next door. It made my eyes sting and left me feeling nauseous. I heard and saw more animals, all mangy, vicious-looking things near the house next door. I was close to tears most of the time. I hardly slept and I had no appetite. It was all too much. And then from somewhere I found a bit of inspiration. The authorities had not lifted a finger to help me when my life was being ruined by the people next door. And I was not naive enough to think that I was going to change, unless I kicked up enough of a fuss. The house next door was a public health hazard. Surely it must have been. And there must have been laws against that, right? I would contact the authorities and the press, and go on social media and demand that something be done. I would name the realtors and urge the late owner's family and lawyer to do something. This wasn't like me. I had spent my entire life being a pushover. Well, enough was enough. It was time to speak out. First, I knew I needed proof. I made sure my mobile phone was fully charged and then I went outside. I began by filming the exterior of the house next door. Water dripped from gutters that were clogged with leaves. The windows were covered in a film of grime, and there was more trash that had just been left in the backyard. It disgusted me, but I knew that it wouldn't be enough. I needed to go inside. It probably won't come as a great surprise to learn that I had no idea how to break into a property. I peered at the lock on the front door and then moved to a window and wondered about smashing it, but decided that I would probably end up cutting myself and I would need to go to the ER. I ended up standing back at the front door, and I kicked it in sheer frustration. There was a cracking sound. I kicked it again harder, and the door broke. I pushed it tentatively with my hand and the door swung open. I was in. The smell hit me first, the bittersweet stench of things gone off. I gagged and covered my mouth and my nose with my hands. My eyes began to water and I blinked rapidly to try and clear my vision. Thankfully, the camera on my phone was unaffected by the miasma lying heavy inside the house. I panned across the narrow hallway, capturing the evidence for my expose. Spider webs hung from the ceiling and the exposed light bulb in its center. They were dotted with flies that had been caught, but there were plenty more that were still free. Some were brushing against my face and hands. I tried to push them away with a sweep of my hand and I walked forwards. The room that I had looked into was to my left. I entered it, keeping one eye on the floor. I didn't want to step on any bugs. I knew they would come off worse, but the thought of having to wipe their squashed remains off the sole of my shoe creeped me out. There didn't seem to be anything wriggling around down there though. I peered nervously into one of the open pizza boxes. A green and black mold spread out across the base of the box. Having seen the mold in the box, I started seeing it everywhere. It crept up the arms of the sofa and filled up burger cartons, and even it reached the walls and the floor. I had been about to put my foot in a big old patch of fungal gunk, but had noticed it just in time. Lucky escape, I thought as I stepped over it, which is when the floor collapsed below my feet. I felt myself falling through rotten floorboards, felt the shock of impact, and the breath being knocked out of my body when I landed moments later. I was in the basement. It was dark and dusty and my head was spinning. I gasped, trying to push myself up, and then something touched one of my hands. I flinched, pulled it up and saw a maggot wriggling on my sleeve. I raised my other hand to squash it but realized that there were more on that hand, and that there were more on my legs and feet, all around me. The ground was covered in them, and they were wriggling under and over each other, and through a skull that was inches from my left hand. It was the skull of a canine, and the bugs were pouring out of its empty sockets and crawling down its fangs. Just beyond the skull were the remains of another animal. I could make out its spine and its pathetically slim tailbone. The bugs were making it twitch, animating it as if it moved. I realized with disgust that these must have been the skeletal remains of the wild animals that I had seen around the house. Somehow they had gotten down here, and they had not escaped. There were dozens of skeletons. I could see that now in the gloom. Some still had flesh on the bone. One was close to whole. Its flesh was dark and rotting and fetid in that confined and airless space. I stared at it, too horrified to move as the bugs slowly began to cover me. I had to get out of there. I had to get out. I told myself this, begged my limbs to move, but I was paralyzed by fear. One of the bugs reached my lips. I couldn't breathe. If I did, I would breathe it in. I felt them on my neck and in my hair. Have to get out, have to get out. My mind raced and somehow I managed to move one of my hands. I lifted it. Bugs covered it like a second writhing skin. I arched my back. I shuffled backward a little, and then I started to get to my feet. Every movement was a battle. Every moment I thought that I was going to fall back down and into a shroud of them. My hands found a wall and I followed it until I found the basement door and I scrambled up the steps. I realized that I had dropped my phone, but there was no way that I was going back for it. I staggered forwards, heading for the hallway, for the front door. And then I was stumbling, falling, and crawling on my hands and knees out onto the front porch. I was still covered in the bugs. I could feel one in my mouth. I spat and a fat, white monstrosity landed in the weeds and wriggled around in a pool of my own phlegm. I clawed at my skin and my hair to try and get more off, all the while heading for my house. I was at my front porch. There were a lot of bugs on the ground by now, but it felt like there were still hundreds of them inside of my clothing. Thankfully, there was no one else there to see as I stripped off my clothes and swept the rest of myself clean as best as I could. And then I ran into my house and straight through to the shower, where I stood under scalding hot water and tried to bear it as long as I could. I was feeling lightheaded by the time that I headed back into my front room. I had on a t-shirt, old blue jeans, and sneakers, and I felt my skin raw but clean at the same time. I sat in my favorite, comfy armchair and took a deep breath. I needed to think, to understand what had just happened, so I could work out what to do next. One explanation came to me quickly. It was that the house next door was somehow changed. It had become a trap, one that attracted victims to feed its new, warped nature. Each victim was drawn in by the scent of the rotting flesh of the animal that had gone before, and me, I had been drawn in on their trail. I knew, though, that this could not be the case, not in a world where science and reason ruled. The truth was, my nerves were shattered and it was my imagination running riot. But I could not shake the feeling that I had been in the grip of something twisted, something malevolent, and I had escaped from it by the skin of my teeth. I took more deep breaths and told myself that I was safe in here, in my ordered, clean house. I just needed to rest, to close my eyes and get a little bit of sleep. I sighed, started to drift off, and then I saw the bug on my pristine floor. It must have wriggled off my body while I was rushing for the shower. I shot to my feet. I needed to stamp on it, but it was gone. It had disappeared into a gap between the floorboards. And then I saw another, and another one. I couldn't stay in this house after this. I would find a motel for the night and then think on what to do next, though I honestly didn't know what that would be. I headed for the door and opened it. The house next door brooded, silent and foul. I stared at its windows, its broken door. Something told me that it wanted me to go back inside and lie down in the darkness. I shook my head. I felt like I was losing my mind. I retreated back into my house and I bolted the door. I'm sitting in my bedroom right now writing this. I'm going to press post soon because it's getting harder and harder to concentrate. I'm so tired and I feel sick, and I can't stop thinking about the house next door. How if I went back, I would finally be at peace. There would be no more noise, no more fear. I would know nothing as I decayed, and the house next door fed on my rotting remains. No, dang it. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go downstairs and leave my house. I'm not going to let myself be drawn into the house next door. I'm going to walk the mile along the road to where there are lights in the distance and passing traffic. I'm going to hitch a ride and go a long way away and start over. This is the end of my story and a beginning.